A black single father, just trying to get his little girl to her grandparents. But one flight attendant, filled with venom and prejudice, makes their journey a living hell. It escalates from sneers to outright racist remarks, culminating in a shocking public slap. Want to know the twist that left Jaws on the floor? Little did she know, the quiet, unassuming man she just assaulted wasn't just any passenger. He was the millionaire who owned the entire plane, the airline, everything. Her career-ending mistake was just the beginning of a takedown so spectacular, so deserved, you'll have to hear it to believe it. Stay tuned to Dark Stories for the full story. The air in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hummed with a familiar, organized chaos. The scent of jet fuel, coffee, and 1,000 hurried perfumes mingled. A soundtrack of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the distant roar of engines. David Freeman, dressed in comfortable jeans, a soft, unbranded Henley, and worn leather sneakers, navigated the A concourse with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveler. Though today, his pace was dictated by the small hand firmly clasped in his. 6-year-old Lily skipped beside him, her bright pink backpack, adorned with a sparkling unicorn, bobbing in rhythm with her steps. Her dark curls, meticulously plaited by David that morning, bounced around a face alight with almost unbearable excitement. "Daddy, will Grandma have the blueberry pancakes ready? The ones with the smiley faces?" David squeezed her hand, a gentle smile touching his lips, though a familiar ache settled in his chest. It had been 6 months since Amelia, his wife, Lily's mother, had lost her battle. This trip to Orlando, to Amelia's parents, was more than a vacation. It was a pilgrimage, a way to keep Amelia's spirit alive for their daughter, and for himself. "I bet she will, sweet pea. Grandma knows all your favorites," he said, deliberately keeping his tone light, masking the effort. He wore an understated but clearly expensive Breitling Navitimer, a gift from Amelia. A subtle incongruity with his otherwise dressed-down appearance, noticeable only to a keen eye. They reached Gate A27, designated for Azure Sky Airlines Flight 712 to Orlando. The Azure Sky branding, a stylized, serene blue bird in flight, was prominent. David had built this airline from a single leased plane into a respected national carrier, founded on principles of service and inclusivity. Principles he felt the need to test personally, from the ground up, now and then. Today, he was just another dad taking his daughter on a trip. He bought Lily a bottle of orange juice and a fruit cup from a nearby kiosk, not glancing at the prices, his focus entirely on her chatter about seeing her cousins. He watched the other passengers, families, business travelers, couples, the quiet hum of anticipation. He hoped for a smooth, uneventful flight for Lily's sake. But what happened next turned this ordinary flight into a nightmare no one saw coming. Stay tuned to Dark Stories to find out how it all unfolded. The boarding call began, starting with priority passengers. Carol Jenkins stood at the podium, her Azure Sky uniform immaculate, but somehow severe. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, accentuating the tired lines etched around her eyes and mouth. A forced, brittle smile was painted on her lips, but it didn't reach the weary cynicism in her gaze. Internally, she was counting the minutes, the flights, until her shift ended. Another plane, another sea of faces, another round of demands and perceived slights. She was on a final written warning after a passenger had complained about her hostile attitude, a complaint she felt was entirely unjustified. Everyone was so sensitive these days. When general boarding for their zone was called, David and Lily joined the queue. As they reached Carol, her eyes flicked over David, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. She just waved through a white businessman whose carry-on clearly pushed the size limits, offering him a strained but polite, "Enjoy your flight, sir. Boarding passes?" Carol said to David, her tone flat, devoid of any welcome. David handed them over. "Carry-ons?" she asked, her gaze dropping pointedly to David's modest duffel bag and Lily's small backpack. "Just these?" David replied evenly. "Make sure all your bags fit completely under the seat in front of you or in the overhead bin." "We have a very full flight," she instructed, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present for the previous passenger. It was a standard instruction, but her delivery made it sound like a personal accusation. As Lily, excited, stepped forward, her small unicorn keychain snagged on her backpack strap, and a little plush narwhal attached to it tumbled to the floor. Oopsie. Lily giggled, bending to retrieve it. Carol let out an audible, impatient sigh. Please, let's keep the aisle clear. Her glance at Lily was sharp, disapproving. Sorry about that, David said, ushering Lily forward. Carol simply pressed her lips together and looked past them to the next passenger, offering no acknowledgement. Lily's giggle died, and she looked up at her father, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. David gave her a reassuring wink, but a knot of unease began to tighten in his own stomach. They found their seats in economy by a window, as Lily had requested. The cabin slowly filled. David helped Lily with her seatbelt and got her settled with her coloring book and a fresh set of crayons. Once airborne and the seatbelt sign was off, the cabin crew began their service. Carol worked their section of the aisle. David saw her approaching and prepared to ask for some water for Lily, who was now engrossed in turning a printed dolphin a vibrant shade of purple. Excuse me, ma'am, David said politely as Carol paused by the row across from them. Carol's eyes met his for a brief moment. He saw a flicker of annoyance, dismissal, before she turned her attention fully to the passenger she was currently serving, a well-dressed older woman. Juice, water, soda? Carol asked her, her voice a practiced, if tired, monotone. She served the woman, then the man next to her. Then, deliberately, she moved her cart past David and Lily's row to serve the row behind them. David waited, assuming she'd circle back. Lily, still coloring, began to softly hum the tune to a cartoon theme song, her feet swinging a little, not quite reaching the floor. It was the quiet, contented sound of a happy child. After several minutes, with no sign of Carol returning, David gently pressed the call button. A different, younger flight attendant, Sarah, arrived. She had a kind smile. Yes, sir? Could my daughter please have a bottle of water? David asked. Of course, Sarah said, and quickly returned with it. As she handed it over, Carol was passing back up the aisle. Her eyes met Sarah's, then flicked to David with a look that made Sarah's smile falter slightly before she hurried off. Later, as Lily worked on a particularly intricate part of her drawing, her humming grew a fraction louder, her small legs kicking gently under the seat with concentration. It was barely audible above the drone of the engines. Suddenly, Carol was there, leaning over. Sir. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin noise. You need to control your child. Some people are trying to rest or work. This isn't a playground. David looked at Lily, who had frozen, crayon midway to the page, her eyes wide. Then he looked at Carol. Other children on the flight were far louder. One a few rows behind was intermittently wailing. My daughter is being very quiet and well-behaved, David said, his voice low and even, but firm. She's just humming to herself. I don't see how she could possibly be disturbing anyone. Carol's lips thinned. It's just a matter of basic courtesy in shared spaces, sir. It's something some people don't seem to understand. It's becoming a real issue on flights these days, this lack of consideration. Her eyes stayed on David, her implication clear and ugly. A young woman in the row ahead, who had been typing on a laptop, visibly winced at Carol's tone and words. She glanced back, offering Lily a hesitant, sympathetic smile, then quickly turned away when she saw Carol's stony expression. David felt a cold anger begin to simmer beneath his calm exterior. He took a slow, deliberate breath. For Lily, always for Lily. The flight continued, the tension a palpable thing around their seats whenever Carol was near. David kept Lily engaged, reading to her softly, pointing out cloud shapes. After a while, Lily whispered, Daddy, I need to go potty. Okay, sweet pea, let's go. David unbuckled her seatbelt and then his own. Carol was in the aisle a couple of rows ahead, facing away from them, speaking to another passenger. David waited for a moment, hoping she would move, but she seemed settled in her conversation. Just squeeze by carefully, honey, David said softly. Lily, small and trying to be unobtrusive, edged into the aisle. As she passed where Carol was standing, gesticulating with one hand while holding a half-empty plastic coffee cup in the other, the tip of Lily's backpack lightly brushed Carol's arm. It was a minor contact, almost imperceptible. A few drops of lukewarm coffee splashed from Carol's cup onto the sleeve of her navy blue uniform. Carol let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. "Oh, for goodness sake. Watch where you're going, you clumsy little," she bit back the end of the sentence, whirling around, her face a mask of fury. Lily froze, her eyes welling up instantly. I am sorry," she stammered, shrinking back against David. David immediately stepped forward, placing himself protectively in front of Lily. His voice, when he spoke, was still quiet, but it carried a new, steely quality. "Ma'am, that is entirely uncalled for. It was a clear accident. My daughter is a child, and she apologized. Now, I expect you to apologize to her for your language and your aggression." Carol's face, already tight with anger, seemed to contort. The accumulated stress of her day, her job, her life, her deeply ingrained prejudices, it all erupted. Years of bitterness found their target. "Apologize," she spat, her voice rising, raw and shaking. "To her, after she practically assaults me with her carelessness? You people are always so entitled, always looking for something, always causing trouble. I am sick of it." The words "you people" hung in the air, venomous and unmistakable. Before David could react, before anyone could intervene, Carol's hand lashed out. Crack, the sound was shocking in the confined space of the airplane cabin. David's head snapped to the side from the force of the slap. A stunned, absolute silence fell, broken only by Lily's sudden, piercing wail of terror. "Daddy!" Passengers stared, mouths agape. The young woman in the row ahead covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. David slowly brought a hand to his cheek, where a red mark was already blooming. He didn't say a word. His eyes, when they focused on Carol, were utterly devoid of heat. Instead, they held a chilling, profound calm that was far more terrifying than any shouted rage. The storm had not just gathered, it had broken. Don't miss what happens next on Dark Stories. The echo of the slap seemed to linger in the pressurized air of the cabin. For a long moment, no one moved. Passengers stared, a collective intake of breath caught in their throats. Carol Jenkins stood, panting slightly, her own hand still half raised, a tremor running through it. Her face was flushed, a mixture of fury and a dawning, ill-defined fear. Lily's sobs, raw and heartbroken, were the only sound, tearing through the silence, each one a fresh stab into David Freeman's heart. He knelt, turning Lily gently towards him, shielding her small body from Carol, from the staring eyes. "Shoo, my little bird. Shoo, Daddy's here. You're safe. It's okay, Lilybug. It's okay." He rocked her gently, his voice a low, soothing murmur against her hair. His cheek throbbed, a dull, insistent pain, but it was nothing compared to the raging inferno of protective fury and cold anger he was carefully banking within himself. For Lily, he had to be calm. He had to be the rock. But beneath the surface, a different kind of storm was gathering, precise and calculating. The junior flight attendant, Sarah, looked utterly horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes darted from Carol's rigid form to David's bleeding cheek, then to the weeping child. She wanted to step forward, to offer comfort, to say something, but a lifetime of deferring to seniority and a very real fear of Carol's infamous temper kept her rooted to the spot, her face pale with distress. Carol's mind raced. He provoked me. He was aggressive. She was out of control. The justifications tumbled through her thoughts, a desperate attempt to build a fortress against the dawning realization of what she'd just done. She had never struck a passenger before. But this man, he had been condescending, his child unruly. It wasn't her fault. It couldn't be. Breaking the stunned silence, Carol's voice, shrill and defensive, pierced the cabin. He was threatening me. He advanced on me. You all saw it, didn't you? He was being aggressive. She looked around wildly, seeking affirmation that wouldn't come. Most passengers avoided her gaze, looking down or away, their discomfort palpable. David, still cradling Lily, didn't raise his voice. His tone was lethally quiet, carrying more weight than any shout. "No one saw that, ma'am, because it did not happen. You have been openly hostile and discriminatory towards my daughter and me since we boarded this aircraft. And then you assaulted me in front of my child and in front of at least 50 witnesses." He made a slight gesture with his head to encompass the nearby passengers. "This is outrageous!" Carol shrieked, seizing the offensive. "I need the captain. This passenger is unruly and has assaulted a crew member." She turned to Sarah, who flinched. "Get Captain Miller now." Sarah, looking like she wanted the floor to swallow her, nodded mutely and hurried towards the cockpit. A few minutes later, Captain Miller emerged. He was a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and an air of weary authority. He'd flown these routes for decades, seen a lot, and generally prided himself on running a tight ship, which to him often meant backing his crew unequivocally, especially senior members like Carol. Carol rushed to him, her voice thick with unshed tears, a masterful performance of a wronged victim. "Oh, Captain, thank goodness." "This passenger," she gestured dramatically towards David, "he became verbally abusive when I simply asked him to mind his child. And then, when I tried to pass, he pushed past me, and when I reacted, he became threatening. I felt I had to defend myself." She carefully omitted the slap she had delivered, framing David as the sole aggressor. Captain Miller listened, his expression hardening as he looked at David. He saw a man in casual clothes with a crying child, and his senior flight attendant alleging assault. His preformed biases and reliance on Carol's version of events clicked into place. "Sir," he said, his voice stern, addressing David, "I understand there's been a significant disturbance. My flight attendant, Miss Jenkins, reports that you became aggressive and physically accosted her. Is this true?" He hadn't yet sought any other accounts, his tone was already accusatory. The commotion, the raised voices, and the distinct sound of a child's distress had drifted forward into the relative calm of the business class cabin. David McMillan, Azure Sky Chief Operating Officer, unbuckled his seatbelt with a sigh of annoyance. He was on his way to an aviation conference in Orlando, hoping for a quiet flight to review his presentation. Disruptions were bad for business, bad for the brand. He emerged into the economy cabin, his tailored suit and air of crisp efficiency immediately drawing attention. He was a man used to being in charge, to fixing problems. Carol's eyes lit up with a desperate kind of relief when she saw him. Here was someone who knew her, someone in real authority. "Mr. McMillan." "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice gaining a renewed note of theatrical desperation. "This passenger," she pointed an accusatory finger at David, "he's been entirely disruptive. He became aggressive with me, and then he assaulted me when I was just trying to do my job and ensure passenger safety." She laid it on thick, emphasizing her supposed fear and his alleged aggression. McMillan surveyed the scene, Carol looking distraught, David calm but with a livid red mark on his cheek, holding a sobbing child, the tense faces of other passengers. Internally, McMillan frowned. Carol Jenkins. He vaguely recalled her file, a few too many passenger complaints about her sharp tongue, her inflexibility. Nothing like this, though. His primary concern was de-escalating the situation quickly, with minimal fallout for Azure Sky. He didn't recognize David at all. In his casual attire, holding a child, he looked nothing like the dynamic, usually suited founder David Freeman he'd met a few times at high-level board meetings. He just saw a potentially problematic passenger. "All right, everyone, let's please try to remain calm," McMillan said, his voice projecting effortless authority. He turned to Carol first. "Miss Jenkins, are you all right? Please take a moment." Then he addressed David, his tone firm but ostensibly neutral, though slightly cooler. "Sir, I am David McMillan, Chief Operating Officer for Azure Sky Airlines. I understand there's been a serious incident. We will certainly get to the bottom of this, however, for the safety and comfort of everyone on board, we need to de-escalate this situation now. We will address this matter fully and properly once we are on the ground in Orlando." His words, while aiming for neutrality, seemed to offer a subtle validation to Carol, addressing her with more apparent concern first. David met McMillan's eyes briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, but he said nothing about their acquaintance. He simply nodded slowly, his focus returning to Lily. Carol, however, visibly straightened, a small, triumphant glint in her eyes. She felt the tide turning in her favor. Feeling emboldened by Macmillan's intervention and Captain Miller's initial siding with her, Carol pressed her advantage. "Sarah, you and Michael, another flight attendant, need to get statements from any passengers who witnessed this man's aggression," she instructed, her voice carrying a note of renewed authority, loud enough for David and those around him to hear clearly. "Document everything, his hostile demeanor, his refusal to control his child." He was clearly unhinged from the start. She was already constructing her narrative, her defense, deflecting all blame. Captain Miller, now standing beside Macmillan, reinforced this. "Sir," he said to David, his tone leaving no room for argument, "I'm going to have to insist you remain in your seat for the remainder of this flight. We will arrange for airport security to meet the aircraft in Orlando to discuss this matter." The implication was clear: David was the one who would be facing security. David merely nodded, his expression unchanging. He settled back into his seat, pulling Lily even closer, murmuring reassurances that were for her ears only. Lily's sobs had subsided into exhausted, hiccuping breaths against his chest. Then, with deliberate, unhurried movements, he reached into the simple duffel bag at his feet and retrieved his cell phone. Several nearby passengers watched him, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in their eyes. He turned slightly, angling his body away, creating a small pocket of privacy. He dialed a number from memory. His voice, when he spoke, was so low it was almost a whisper, yet each word was enunciated with icy precision. The contrast with the surrounding tension was stark. "This is David Freeman. Azure Skyflight 712, en route to MCO. We have a code red situation. Authorize and initiate Protocol Omega immediately." A brief pause. "Yes, confirmed. Passenger assault on owner by crew member. Strong indicators of racial bias contributing. I need Miss Evans, head of in-flight services, and our chief legal counsel to meet me personally at the arrival gate in Orlando. No local law enforcement for me. Is that clear? My primary concern at this moment is the welfare of my daughter. Second is the immediate containment and removal of the crew member responsible upon landing. Handle this discreetly until I advise otherwise." He listened for another moment, then said, "Understood. Thank you." He ended the call, his face a stoic mask. Lily looked up at him, her tear-stained face etched with confusion. "Daddy, what's Pal Mega?" David managed a faint, reassuring smile, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "It's just a way to make sure the mean lady doesn't bother anyone else, little bird. Daddy's handling it." Across the aisle, the young woman who had earlier offered Lily a sympathetic smile, and who had watched the entire exchange with growing outrage, discreetly angled her own phone. The injustice of what she was witnessing, the calm, dignified father being treated as the aggressor while the hysterical flight attendant was coddled, was too much. She pressed record. The light on her phone was off, the screen dimmed. She captured David's quiet dignity, Lily's distress, and Carol's increasingly agitated demeanor as she conferred with the other flight attendants, loudly reiterating her ordeal. The pieces for Act 3 were slowly, inexorably falling into place. Azure Sky Airlines Flight 712 began its slow, arcing descent towards Orlando. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken anxieties and whispered conjectures. Passengers, now aware that a significant confrontation had occurred, cast furtive glances towards David Freeman's row, where he sat calmly, Lily having finally cried herself into an exhausted, uneasy sleep against his shoulder. He gently stroked her hair, his expression unreadable, betraying none of the steely resolve coiled within him. His gaze occasionally drifted towards the window, watching the distant lights of the city grow closer, not as a tourist, but as a man awaiting a reckoning he himself had set in motion. Carol Jenkins moved through the cabin, assisting with final landing preparations. Her earlier agitation had been replaced by a veneer of strained professionalism, but beneath it lay a current of smug anticipation. She had given her statement to Captain Miller, embellishing her fear, emphasizing David's alleged unprovoked aggression. She'd seen Macmillan's initial deference to her as staff. She firmly believed that upon landing, the disruptive passenger would be handed over to airport authorities, and she would be vindicated. She even shared a brief, confident nod with Captain Miller as he passed her in the aisle after making his pre-landing announcement. The captain's voice had boomed through the PA system with the usual platitudes about the weather in Orlando and baggage claim information. Then he'd added, his tone carrying a subtle but unmistakable edge, "For operational reasons, we request that the passenger involved in the earlier disturbance in row 22 please remain seated after we have docked at the gate until a member of our crew or ground personnel can speak with you directly. We appreciate your cooperation." Carol allowed herself a small, internal smile. Justice. The plane touched down at Orlando International Airport, MCO, with a gentle bump, taxiing smoothly towards its designated gate. The familiar chime sounded, indicating it was safe to unbuckle seatbelts. Passengers began to stir, eager to deplane. Carol positioned herself strategically near the forward galley, her eyes fixed on row 22. She was ready, almost eager, to point David out to the airport police she expected to see waiting just inside the jet bridge. As he remained seated, gently rousing a sleepy Lily, Carol shot him a look that was a mixture of disdain and triumph. The door of the aircraft opened, and the jet bridge connected with a muffled thud. The first few passengers began to disembark. Carol watched the entrance expectantly, but the figures who appeared at the aircraft door were not the uniformed airport police officers she had envisioned. First, a woman with an impeccably tailored business suit and a severe, no-nonsense expression stepped aboard. This was Miss Eleanor Evans, Azure Sky's formidable head of in-flight services, a woman known for her sharp intellect and zero tolerance for misconduct. Flanking her were two individuals in equally sober business attire, their briefcases radiating an aura of legal counsel. And trailing just behind them, looking ashen-faced and visibly trembling, was David McMillan, the COO. His earlier air of confident authority had completely evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of dread. He studiously avoided Carol's gaze, his eyes darting nervously towards David. The shift in McMillan's demeanor was the first discordant note in Carol's symphony of anticipated victory. Miss Evans's keen eyes scanned the cabin briefly before settling on Carol. Her voice, when she spoke, was devoid of warmth, clipped and professional. "Carol Jenkins, please step over here with me now." There was no request in her tone, only command. Carol's brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Miss Evans, what is this? The passenger who assaulted me? The one causing all the trouble? He's right there." She gestured towards David, who was now helping a still groggy Lily into her little pink backpack. David McMillan finally spoke, his voice strained, almost pleading, "Carol, just please listen to Miss Evans." He looked like a man facing his own execution. Miss Evans stepped closer to Carol, her gaze unwavering and cold. "Carol Jenkins," she began, her voice low but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed front section of the aircraft. "Based on multiple corroborating eyewitness accounts from passengers, statements from other crew members, and a preliminary but damning review of your conduct on this flight, it has been determined that your actions were grossly unprofessional, egregiously discriminatory, and included an unprovoked act of physical assault against a passenger in front of his minor child." Each word was a hammer blow. Carol's face began to lose its color. "Therefore," Miss Evans continued relentlessly, "your employment with Azure Sky Airlines is terminated. Effective immediately, you will surrender your company identification badge and all other Azure Sky property to me before you disembark. You will be escorted from airport premises." "Terminated?" Carol gasped, her voice a choked whisper. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of panic. But he was the one. He was aggressive. "Mr. McMillan, you saw it, Captain Miller made a report." She looked wildly from Miss Evans to McMillan, then towards the cockpit where Captain Miller was just emerging, his face etched with sudden apprehension as he took in the scene. Miss Evans cut her off. "Captain Miller's report and his handling of this entire incident will also be subject to a rigorous internal review, Miss Jenkins." Her eyes then flicked towards David, who was now standing calmly, Lily holding his hand, watching the proceedings with a quiet intensity. Then Miss Evans delivered the final, devastating blow, her voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its steel. The passenger you verbally abused, racially profiled, and physically assaulted, Miss Jenkins, the man you and Captain Miller were seemingly preparing to have detained, is Mr. David Aurelius Freeman." She paused, letting the name hang in the air. Mr. Freeman is the founder, the principal shareholder, and the chairman of the board of directors of Azure Sky Airlines. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Carol Jenkins. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a sickly, mottled white. Her jaw went slack, her eyes wide with a dawning, abject horror that was almost painful to witness. The name, the title, the sheer impossible reality of it crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She swayed, her hand reaching out blindly, grasping the edge of a galley counter for support. The smugness, the aggression, the self-righteous indignation, all of it evaporated, replaced by a raw, visceral terror. She looked at David, truly seeing him for the first time, not as the target of her prejudice, but as the man who held her entire world in his hands, a world she had just single-handedly, spectacularly destroyed. The silence that followed Miss Evans's revelation was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of the airport. Captain Miller stood frozen near the cockpit door, his face a mask of dawning comprehension and deep regret. The other crew members, including a wide-eyed Sarah, looked on in stunned disbelief. Miss Evans gestured subtly to one of the men from legal. "Miss Jenkins, Mr. Davies here will escort you to a private office where the necessary paperwork will be completed. Please cooperate fully." Her tone was final. Carol, looking utterly broken, could only nod numbly, her fight completely extinguished. David finally spoke, his voice still low, still calm, yet it resonated with an undeniable authority that cut through the stunned atmosphere. He addressed Miss Evans and Mr. Macmillan directly, his gaze unwavering. Lily, now more awake, looked from her father to the pale-faced flight attendant with a child's intuitive understanding that something very serious was happening. "Eleanor, David began, this isn't merely about a termination, though that is unequivocally necessary. What occurred on this flight was a physical assault upon my person, witnessed by dozens. More disturbingly, it was the culmination of a pattern of clear, unambiguous racial discrimination directed at both myself and my 6-year-old daughter by an employee entrusted with our care and safety." His eyes hardened. "I expect Azure Sky Airlines to pursue all appropriate and severe internal disciplinary actions against anyone who enabled, tolerated, or failed to adequately address this egregious misconduct. That includes a thorough review of Captain Miller's handling of the initial report and his subsequent actions, or lack thereof." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Furthermore," he stated, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "I will be filing a formal police report with the Orlando Police Department regarding the assault. This airline, my airline, was built on a foundation of respect, inclusivity, and unparalleled customer service. Today, that foundation was attacked from within by prejudice and violence that will not stand." David Macmillan visibly flinched at the mention of a police report and the directness of David's condemnation. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, looking utterly defeated. Miss Evans simply nodded curtly. "Understood, Mr. Freeman. We will cooperate fully with any external investigation, and our internal review will be immediate and exhaustive." The legal counsel, Mr. Davies, gently but firmly guided a now silently weeping Carol Jenkins by the arm. As she was led away, a ghost of her former self, the young woman passenger who had filmed the incident, stepped forward, hesitantly, holding her phone. "Excuse me, Miss Evans, Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice a little shaky. I think I have something that might be important. I have a video recording of the entire incident, the things Miss Jenkins said, and the slap. Everything." A fresh wave of dismay washed over Macmillan's face. Miss Evans, however, looked at the young woman with professional gratitude. "Thank you. We will need to speak with you. This unsolicited evidence would only solidify the already indefensible." With Carol removed, a palpable sense of relief mingled with shock began to settle over the remaining crew and the few passengers who had witnessed the drama unfold. David finally allowed himself a small, tired sigh. He knelt down to Lily. "It's all over now, sweet pea. The mean lady is gone and won't be hurting anyone on our airplanes again." Lily nodded, her eyes still wide. "Did she get a big timeout, Daddy?" Yes, baby, David said softly, smoothing her hair. A very, very big timeout. Miss Evans and a profoundly humbled, almost supplicant David Macmillan approached David. Mr. Freeman, Macmillan began, his voice strained, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what you and your daughter endured, for my own initial misjudgment of the situation. There are no excuses. Miss Evans added, we will take immediate steps to ensure every passenger on this flight is contacted, and a full review of our discrimination and conflict resolution training protocols will begin tomorrow morning, with your oversight, if you wish, sir. David nodded. It will be necessary, Eleanor. This cannot be a buried incident. It must be a catalyst for reinforcement and change. He then looked toward Sarah, the junior flight attendant, who was watching them with a mixture of awe and trepidation. David offered her a small, kind smile. Sarah, isn't it? She nodded, surprised he knew her name. Your kindness to my daughter earlier, offering her water when your colleague would not, did not go unnoticed. Thank you. His smile faded slightly. And please remember, in any situation, you always have a voice. Never let anyone intimidate you into silence when you witness something that you know in your heart is wrong. Azure Sky needs people with your integrity. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. I will remember that. Finally, David took Lily's hand. Come on, sweet pea. Grandma and Grandpa are waiting. They walked off the plane, leaving behind a scene of quiet turmoil and impending professional upheaval. As they stepped into the bright Orlando terminal, David glanced back briefly at the Azure Sky logo on the side of the aircraft, his airline, his responsibility. The fight today had been ugly, personal, but it would serve a purpose. He was more than just a millionaire owner. He was a father who had protected his child, a leader who had confronted injustice head-on within his own domain, and a man determined to ensure that the values upon which he'd built his company were not just words in a mission statement, but a lived reality for every single passenger and employee. The Florida sunshine felt warm on their faces as they headed towards the exit, towards family, and towards the beginning of a healing process, for Lily, for himself, and for the airline that bore his mark. 2 months later, the stale air in Carol Jenkins' small, sparsely furnished apartment hung heavy with the scent of microwave meals and unwashed laundry. The blinds were perpetually drawn, casting the room in a perpetual twilight that mirrored the gloom in her soul. The vibrant Azure Sky uniform, once a symbol of her identity and modest pride, now lay crumpled in a heap at the bottom of her closet, a constant, silent accusation. Her termination had been swift and brutal. The escort from airport premises had been mortifying, though Miss Evans had ensured it was handled with a cold, professional discretion that somehow made it worse. No dramatic scene, just the quiet, efficient excision of Carol Jenkins from the life she had known for over 20 years. The letter from the Federal Aviation Administration had arrived a week ago. It was a formal notification of an investigation into her conduct, citing credible reports of passenger endangerment through discriminatory behavior and physical assault. It strongly implied that her flight attendant certification was unlikely to be renewed, a death knell for any hope of flying again for any airline. The blacklisting was not just institutional, it was becoming official. A summons lay on her cluttered coffee table, half hidden beneath a pile of overdue bills. David Freeman had pressed charges. Her first court appearance for misdemeanor assault was next week. Her court-appointed lawyer had been blunt, the video evidence was damning. The victim's identity made it a high-profile embarrassment for the airline he owned, and a plea bargain was her best, albeit grim, option. Carol slumped onto her worn sofa, the television flickering an old black-and-white movie she wasn't watching. Sleep offered little respite. Her dreams were filled with falling, with accusatory glares, with the sound of a child's terrified cry and the chillingly calm voice of David Freeman. She replayed the incident endlessly, not with remorse for her actions, but with a spiraling, bitter resentment. It wasn't fair. He had provoked her. That child was out of control. They were always looking for a handout, for special treatment. The racist tropes she had harbored for years had become her only companions, her shield against the crushing weight of her reality. There was no epiphany here, no dawning understanding of the harm she had caused, only the sour certainty that she was the victim, unfairly persecuted by a powerful man who had, in her distorted view, set out to ruin her. The karma was indeed hard, and for Carol, it was a solitary confinement in the prison of her own unexamined prejudice. Her phone rarely rang. Old colleagues had distanced themselves. The world, as she knew it, had shrunk to the four walls of her dim apartment. The late afternoon sun streamed into David Freeman's spacious but unostentatious home office. Architectural blueprints for a new community youth center he was funding lay across his large mahogany desk, but his attention was on a small, framed photograph beside his computer. Amelia, smiling, her eyes bright. Beside it, Lily, now 7, was meticulously drawing at a smaller desk David had set up for her in the corner, humming softly, a happy, carefree sound that was music to his ears. The trip to Orlando had been salvaged. Mostly, Lily had her blueberry pancakes with smiley faces, played with her cousins, and for moments, the shadow of Flight 712 had receded. But there were still quiet times, usually before bed, when Lily would ask, "Daddy, why was that lady so angry at us?" And David would hold her close, explaining in simple terms that sometimes people carry unhappiness inside them, and they let it spill out in ugly ways. But it wasn't Lily's fault. Never Lily's fault. He emphasized that most people were kind, like Sarah the flight attendant, like the lady who gave her the crayon, like Grandma and Grandpa. Therapy had helped Lily process the fear, and her natural resilience was a marvel. For David, the incident had been a harsh reminder. He'd built Azure Sky with an idealistic vision, but a vision required constant vigilance. He'd spent weeks in intense meetings with Miss Evans, with legal, with HR, and with diversity and inclusion consultants. The Protocol Omega had been a contingency he hoped never to use, designed for extreme emergencies, but its activation had laid bare both failures and opportunities. He picked up a newly printed employee handbook, its cover bearing a refreshed Azure Sky logo with the tagline, "Our Sky for Everyone." Inside, the code of conduct was rewritten with zero-tolerance policies for discrimination and harassment spelled out in unequivocal terms. New, truly anonymous reporting channels were active. Mandatory empathy and de-escalation training, incorporating implicit bias awareness, was being rolled out company-wide, starting with senior management and flight crews. He himself had led the first session for his executive team, sharing his experience not as the owner, but as a black man, a father who had been made to feel unwelcome and unsafe on his own airline. The rawness of his account had been more impactful than any corporate directive. He glanced at Lily, her brow furrowed in concentration over her artwork. Protecting her, ensuring she grew up in a world that saw her for who she was, not for the color of her skin, that was his driving force. The slap had been a personal wound, but it had also firmed his resolve. He would use his power, his resources, not for revenge, but for relentless systemic change. In a brightly lit training room at Azure Sky's Orlando MCO hub, a new cohort of flight attendants listened intently. Miss Eleanor Evans stood at the front, her demeanor as exacting as ever, but with a new layer of earnest emphasis. "Azure Sky is more than an airline," she stated, her gaze sweeping the room. "It is a promise of safety, respect, and welcome to every single individual who chooses to fly with us and to every colleague who works alongside us." That promise was broken. We are here to ensure it is never broken again. The training module was new, interactive, filled with real-world scenarios, many uncomfortably similar to what David and Lily had endured. Discussions were frank, sometimes difficult. Role-playing focused not just on service protocols, but on recognizing and addressing microaggressions, on active bystander intervention, on de-escalating conflict without bias. Captain Miller was not in this training room, nor in any cockpit for Azure Sky. Following a thorough review, he had been offered early retirement, which he had taken. His failure to properly assess the situation, his immediate bias towards Carol's account, and his dismissal of David's initial calm complaints had been deemed an unacceptable lapse in judgment and leadership. David McMillan, the COO, had survived, but his position was tenuous. He had issued a company-wide apology, acknowledging his own initial missteps on Flight 712. He was now spearheading many of the new training initiatives, a chastened figure working visibly hard to regain trust, both internally and from David Freeman. He knew he was on his last chance. The video filmed by the passenger had inevitably leaked. Initially, it was a PR nightmare for Azure Sky, but David had made the decision to address it head-on, releasing a personal statement acknowledging the incident, detailing the immediate actions taken against Carol Jenkins and outlining the comprehensive reforms underway. Transparency, he'd insisted, was the only way forward. The public response, after initial outrage at the incident itself, had slowly shifted towards cautious approval of the airline's robust response under its owner's direct guidance. Employee morale, particularly among staff from minority backgrounds, saw a tentative uplift as they witnessed tangible changes and a commitment from the very top. Several months later, on a routine Azure Sky flight from Atlanta to Dallas, flight attendant Sarah confidently and kindly assisted an elderly passenger struggling to place his bag in the overhead bin. Later, when a young mother looked overwhelmed with a fussy baby, Sarah was there with a warm smile, a bottle of water, and an offer to hold the infant for a few minutes so the mother could rest. She moved through the cabin with a newfound assurance, her interactions marked by genuine empathy. She remembered Mr. Freeman's words daily. David, on a rare flight where he wasn't incognito, but was traveling as himself for a conference, observed her briefly from his seat in business class. He didn't interact, not wanting to make her self-conscious, but he noted her quiet professionalism, her genuine warmth. It was a small sign, but a hopeful one. He looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. The sky was indeed for everyone, but ensuring that truth on the ground, in the cabins of his planes, in the hearts and minds of his employees, was an ongoing journey. The slap on Flight 712 had left an echo, a reminder that prejudice was a stubborn weed, always needing to be pulled. The reckoning had been delivered. The immediate storm had passed, but the work of tending the garden, of fostering true inclusivity, was a vigilance that could never truly rest. It was a father's promise, magnified by a leader's responsibility, carried on the winds of change. And so, Carol Jenkins's mask completely shattered under the weight of the truth. From a flight attendant who thought she had the right to judge others, she faced a fitting punishment, losing her job, facing legal charges for assault, and perhaps an indelible stain on her career in the service industry. What goes around comes around. David Freeman not only reclaimed justice for himself and his daughter Lily, but also turned this horrific incident into a profound reform within Azure Sky Airlines, emphasizing a culture of respect and zero tolerance for any form of discrimination. This story serves as a stark reminder that arrogance and prejudice based on appearance or race can lead to devastating consequences. Sometimes, the person you look down upon the most might be the one who holds your destiny in their hands. But more importantly, it demonstrates the power of composure, dignity, and using one's authority responsibly to create positive change rather than seeking revenge. Justice may be delayed, but it will surely come to those who deserve it. We hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat. If you loved it, don't forget to hit the like button on this video to support Dark Stories. And most importantly, please click subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss out on any other compelling stories from our channel. Every subscription is a huge motivation for Dark Stories to continue bringing you more quality content.